let's move on. I would like to ask you these questions. First of all, briefly, let's talk about the qualities that a journalist, especially an upcoming journalist, needs to have before he or she becomes an investigative journalist.
Yeah, so well, I would say that the things that make for good journalism are the things very much the same qualities that make for investigative journalism. I think with investigative journalism in particular, you want to be curious, you want to be hungry, you want to be skeptical, and you need to be tenacious and persistent and resilient. Because as you said, it does often take a long time. Things don't reveal themselves right away. And so you need to have stamina and a very deep commitment to hang in there while things aren't clear, while things aren't coming through, if you're getting critiqued or attacked. So I would say those are some of the qualities. And again, those are qualities you want in journalists in general, but with investigative, I would say those are some of the qualities you're looking for.
So, like, what do you have to say to the upcoming journalists about the risks, hazards, and dangers associated with investigative journalism, so they get to know what they are up against?
Yeah, well, I would say we need you. We need you in our community. We need young journalists. We need hungry journalists. We need journalists from all different backgrounds. We need journalists of color. We need journalists of different genders. Need, and I would say a challenge in our community, both within the United States and globally, is that the people who do investigative reporting have not been as diverse as the communities we cover. So the first thing I would say is we need young journalists, and I'll do anything I can to help. That's a big commitment that we have at CCIJ and that I have personally. The other thing I would say is that it is important to recognize that there are risks associated with being an investigative journalist, but depending on especially the country you're in, the part of the country you're in, the level of experience you have, the newsroom that you're in. So it is important to understand that depending on where you are and what you're doing and what you're digging into, there are very real risks, and it's not for everybody. And so that's absolutely okay to know that. But I would say we need you. There are risks, and that there is a community of people around the world who are very committed to the next generation.
All right. So, for example, we talk about the experience that a journalist should have, depending on, like, okay, the risks happen depending on the kind of experience that one journalist or the other has. So, are you saying that some of the investigative journalists that we have, especially the upcoming ones, are so naive that they end up getting caught up in a mess while in the course of their work?
No, I appreciate the question. I'm not saying that, and I apologize if that was the impression that I gave. What I was just saying is that sometimes younger journalists can be perceived as being able to be pressurized in certain ways as compared with someone who might be a more established journalist and have a certain safety or security under the fact of having reported for a while. Now, as you mentioned, experienced journalists got killed at high rates last year, so that's no guarantee. And the murders and assassinations are only the most extreme manifestation of a set of anti-journalist actions. But I was simply suggesting that sometimes, depending on the level of the experience, the opponents of truth might say, okay, this is someone we can work on, as opposed to someone else who's been at it for a long time and may have a certain reputation and a certain level of protection that way. So that's what I meant by that. But thank you for that clarifying question.
Of course, of course. As a professor also of journalism, if a student of yours asks you for advice by saying that, sir, I'm willing to go into North Korea or Russia or China, for example, for an undercover investigative work, would you motivate them and say, hey, go for it?
I would probably not say go undercover as a student in China or North Korea or Russia. It would depend on the student, it would depend on their life experience, it would depend on where they are in their career. The decision to go undercover is a very serious one. I know in Nigeria and other parts on the African continent, many fine investigative journalists have come to the conclusion, other parts of the world as well, this is the only way to get the story. But for a young journalist, and as their first assignment, that's a very complicated thing to do. So I would say I would not advise that journalist. Again, it depends on the student and so on, but in the whole, I would probably say do not do that. Now, if someone is interested in doing investigative journalism, I just worked with 3 students on about a 7-month, 8-month project with USA Today's National Investigative Team, and they did different reporting tasks, and they were part of the team, and I think they had a good experience. I think they're considering doing that, and so you know that's the kind of thing that I would orient. Now, I do have a former student who was a Green Beret, and he's retired military, and has been in very, very many dangerous situations. So with that person, I might have a different conversation. But on the whole, going undercover as your first investigative job in a very, very dangerous country, no, I wouldn't recommend that.
So one could say you're discouraging students from getting involved in investigative journalism.
Well, you could say I would say I'm committed to student safety and learning how to enter a field with appropriate risk, and that as a professor entrusted by the state of Michigan and paid for by public dollars, and really just as someone who's committed to young people in general, that I would not be fulfilling my ethical and professional responsibility to encourage people to go into those types of specific situations with that level of experience. And then my students, generally coming from the United States, I don't think that would be ethical or responsible. In terms of encouraging young people to go into investigative journalism, I'm very committed to that.
All right, briefly, have you ever been undercover as an investigative journalist?
I have not, but you know, I work and report in the United States, where there are some people who do go undercover, UMAR, but generally it's sort of, you really only do that as the last resort. And at least up till now, for almost all the cases, some people have done it very famously, and a team in the Sun, a Chicago newspaper, won a Pulitzer Prize in the 70s for doing it. It's not that it never happens, but as I said, my primary professional, personal reporting experience is in the United States and doing more data-oriented work. So I have not gone undercover. I have friends and colleagues who have done it, but that's not been my experience.
But for those who go undercover, do they get some special training and skills from the intelligence agency, like the CIA in the US, or NIA in Nigeria, or BND of Germany, and so on and so forth?
Yeah, no. Generally, I mean, it depends. Some places, like there's a very famous Ghanaian investigative journalist named Anas, and he actually works quite actively with law enforcement, not on how to be a journalist, but on his projects. But generally, you know, very, very rarely will investigative journalists get training from government agencies. Now, I think there's, you know, at the Global Investigative Journalism Network, there are sometimes sessions at the conferences about how to go undercover and so on. I think people talk with each other. But for example, I just got a very powerful story from a friend and colleague from Cameroon, Christian Loka. And he went undercover for months, and he was uncovering different levels of trafficking and the ports and who went where and who went there, and just incredibly brave work and very dangerous. And he takes the reader through the very point where he pulled back and pulled out of it. But that's very brave and risky work. So finding out about it from people who have done it before is a very good idea, but getting training from the government doesn't happen in my experience.
Okay, good. Let me put to you 2 questions from two of our viewers.
Yeah.
This one from Zulfa, she says, are the consequences of investigative journalism the same everywhere? For example, she says, we know that the practice of investigative journalism is this like, is it the same in the US, in the developed countries, as it is in Nigeria?
Well, that's a very good question. So what's happening more and more is that, I know you mentioned this earlier, like with what we do with some collaborative, we're on a much smaller scale, but International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, ICIJ, or there's a group out of Eastern Europe called Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. What's happening is that more and more journalists are collaborating across borders and sharing resources and information. So it's a much more collaborative approach, and we try to do that within our team and then with other news organizations. But no, absolutely, it looks different in different places. And then I would say, honestly, we're getting a West Africa hub going, led by Ajibola Amzat. And so there's a gentleman, Haruna Mohammed, who runs this outfit called Wiki Times, which you may be familiar with. So Wiki Times very specifically concentrates on the areas outside of Abuja, outside of Lagos, the areas that get covered in different ways. And so they're doing their investigations in a different way than in the urban centers and the political capital and so on. So absolutely, it's a great question. And journalism does play out differently across countries, investigative journalism, but also within countries. And then in different parts of the country, there's different risks and so on. But the general goal of trying to expose wrongdoing and hold people to account, that's the same everywhere. The commitment to truth, that's the same everywhere. But as far as how it gets carried out, it can vary by place.
Which brings me to her second question. Zulfa says, maybe you can answer it in 1 or 2 sentences. What is the one rule that an investigative journalist should stick to?
Well, I would say that the one rule to stick to is to be relentless in pursuing and exposing the truth about wrongdoing and holding those people to account for the damage that happens out of individual or even systemic abuses. That's what I would say. That's really what.
Yeah, this one says, hi, my name is Uzair Adam, a level 300 student of mass communication from Bayero University, Kano. He says, as a veteran investigative journalist whose professionalism has attracted global recognition and admiration, he's talking about you. What was your worst experience and how did you handle it?
Well, no, thank you. Well, thank you for the kind words. But I would say, I think one of my worst experiences was when I did a story. I was working with this. It was not investigative, but I was working with a weekly newspaper on the south side of Chicago, and I was doing a story about sex offenders in the community. And so a woman trusted me with her story about how her partner and father of one of her children had sexually abused another daughter of hers. And so what happened was she did it on the condition that I not use her name so that she would not be identified. So while I was writing the story, I wrote the name in the story to be able to picture what had happened. And then I eliminated all of the names except one. So in one instance in that story, I left the woman's name in after I had told her that I wouldn't do that. So that was a very painful moment. I got it wrong. She called me and said, Jeff, you said you wouldn't do that. I said, you're absolutely right. I'm extremely sorry. It was my mistake. And nothing, bad happened as a result, because of it to her. But it's something that really, to get back to your question earlier, one of the people's questions about fact checking, it was something that stays with me. And, kind of, if ever I think, okay, well, let me just let it go, I go back and check one more time just to make sure to try and get things as right as possible, because it's a very serious thing that woman trusted me with. I made a mistake. I got it wrong. And it was much more painful for her because she had trusted me and then I had unintentionally violated that trust. But it was a painful moment for me because what I intended to do was the opposite of what happened. And it was a very private and painful moment that she had entrusted me with that I had failed in that regard to fulfill. So I appreciate the question. That was back in 2004, but I still remember it very vividly.
So you're gonna have to live for the rest of your life with this?
Yeah, yes,
So
yes. Yeah, I mean, we're all human. We all make mistakes, and hopefully from the mistakes we make, they become sources to try and learn and then pass it forward so that the people who come after us hopefully avoid making those same mistakes. But maybe there are investigative journalists who don't make mistakes, but I make mistakes, and that was one of them. And I do have to live with it. That was my mistake. I made it. It was wrong. I apologized. I tried to make it better, but especially we were print at that point, so it was print publication. It was out there in the world. It was on me. It was my mistake. I have to live with it.
but to clarify, you said nothing bad happened to her.
No, I mean, other than what I did, I don't want to minimize what I did. I'm just saying in terms of she was worried about the person finding out and so on. I don't think he read the paper and that kind of stuff. So the specific thing that she was worried about was okay, but the bottom line is I didn't keep up my end, and I made a mistake that, as you said, I have to live with.
Yeah. Finally, it's about sources. Sometimes, as an investigative journalist, Uzair says, you may discover some misconducts and want to write about them. However, all your efforts will be stuck with the lack of sources to interview. Who will give you more details on the topic? How did you deal with such issue? Briefly.
It's very hard. I mean, it depends on the issue and it depends on what you're trying to uncover. But what I would say is, and Ray Joseph did this very well in South Africa on the lottery project that we did, is maybe you don't try to do it all in one story. Maybe you write a story based on what you have, and then somebody reaches out to you and says, well, you looked at this, but you really want to look at that. So then you write the second story. And after the second story, somebody else says, well, you're digging here, but you could have looked at that. And so in other words, he wrote more than 150 stories about the lottery. And it wasn't until he was deep, deep into the corruption from the outside of the South African lottery that people started saying, hey, let me show you what's really going on, and leaking him really sensitive stuff that now he's gone and had great impact. So you try and be as creative as possible with your sources. If you know people, you try and get them to talk to you, but it's okay to just put a foot in the ground, put another foot in the ground, and put another foot in the ground, another foot in the ground. And then if you're in the area and you're reporting fairly and accurately, people will find you and talk to you if you're trustworthy and then worthy of the trust in the way that, as we just discussed, I was not in that instance with that woman, but I try hard to do in all my work since.
All right. Sorry about that. So sorry. Well, before we go, please, there is one of my friends, Fadal Sheo Muhammad, who asked me, how would I become an investigative journalist? I think, did you talk about that in the beginning?
Well, there's not a formal process. What I would do, it depends if the person is a journalist. I'm happy to chat with that person if they're interested in finding out. And as I said, we do have Ajibola Amzad, who's a very fine investigative reporter, who is our Africa editor. So I would imagine he would be eager to talk with that person as well. But basically, I would just start small, study people who have done it at a high level, find out people who can mentor you, and just try to incorporate one investigative skill or technique per story. So don't try and do it all at once, but just gradually build an investigative practice and consider joining either a national organization, an international organization like Investigative Reporters and Editors, largely US, Global Investigative Journalism Network. Join a professional group that does this work. Wole Soyinka Center, Morton Rayolaka runs, does absolutely tremendous work. So, find people who are doing the work who are farther down the road and learn from them.
Good. Many thanks indeed, Professor Jeff Kelly Lowenstein, for speaking to me on Global Arena. We got a lot to discuss, but time is not by our side. We hope we will set up another Zoom interview with you and talk about the moral issues regarding the investigative journalists, because it's also another issue of debate whether it's morally okay for somebody to investigate and discover some hidden corruption regarding a particular politician or company or something like that. We hope whenever you're free, we'll be able to do that.
All right, I'd be honored to come back. I appreciate the opportunity. I love the questions, and so very much appreciate the opportunity to dialogue. And if people are interested in our community, we're at our organizational website is CCIJ.io, and our publication site is VEZA.news, VEZA.news. So no, thank you very much. Congratulations on all the work you're doing, and just look forward to continuing the conversation, the connection. Thank you very much.
Yeah. I hope you enjoyed the interview, the style of the
Very
questions.
much.
And
very much. Very much.
Good.
Thank you.
Yeah, many thanks indeed. So briefly, that's the end of my interview with Professor JEFF Lowenstein. I'm doing a kind of conclusion.
Okay.
Yeah, so for our viewers, that's been Professor JEFF Kelly Lowenstein, an American multilingual professor of journalism and an investigative journalist as well. And he is the founder and director of Center for Collaborative Investigative Journalism. Thank you very much indeed. Looking forward to hosting you very soon.
Okay, thank you.